How do you assess this summer-autumn offensive, and what does it mean for the Russian Federation? Well, let's put it this way. Breaking through the defense by November by any of the next deadlines did not succeed. What further actions is the Russian Federation capable of? What forces does it have? Does it have the resources for this? Or will the deadlines just be pushed back? Deadlines? Well, not by November, but let's say by December. After all, the Russian Federation has been trying to take Pokrovsk for more than a year now, and still hasn't succeeded. These are just shifts in plans. Or is something else being prepared? And as they say, what can we realistically expect, so to speak?
At this point, we can state that the summer-autumn campaign of the Russian occupation forces in Ukraine has, first and foremost, resulted in a political failure. We're talking about yet another failure to meet the so-called political deadlines set by the Russian dictator. Let me remind you, it was precisely during the visit of the Kremlin's special representative Dmitriev to the United States that this information began to appear in the media. The report by the head of the General Staff of the occupying country's army claims supposedly significant tactical successes by Russian occupiers in several directions. These include the Pokrovsk, Kupiansk directions and Vovchansk. The assessments voiced in the Russian General Staff's report, at the very least, do not correspond to reality and at most are completely detached from the actual events on the line of contact. The point is that there is no control over Pokrovsk, and moreover, there is no operational encirclement of the Ukrainian group at all. Let me remind you, Gerasimov reported to the Russian dictator that supposedly 31 Ukrainian battalions were blocked in Pokrovsk. For context, that's about 6 to 7 brigades. This information caused confusion even among the so-called Russian war correspondents. What is happening at the moment? In Pokrovsk, at the moment, stabilization measures are underway. The Ukrainian Defense Forces, as you have already reported, by order of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky additional and operational reserves have been deployed to stabilize the situation. And accordingly, special units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Special Operations Forces have been deployed to the city. So, against the backdrop of these successful actions by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the Russian occupiers are primarily preparing a series of bloody provocations under so-called false flags. Salute. To discredit the Ukrainian Defense Forces and the Ukrainian intelligence community. According to operational information, the Russian side is preparing, firstly, a demonstrative shooting of the local population remaining in Pokrovsk under the guise of alleged counter-sabotage operations by special units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense and the Special Operations Forces. The goal is to accuse the Ukrainian side right before a possible Russian-American summit at the highest representative level of violating the norms and rules of warfare. And the second provocation. This is accordingly the possibility of carrying out a selective, that is a pinpoint strike on locations of possible either temporary or permanent deployment. Representatives of the media, whom the Russian dictator has already invited to Pokrovsk to cover the situation on the line of combat contact. These are the bloody provocations that should be spoken about openly based on the situations at the line of combat contact. And I want to emphasize once again, the occupiers have no real successes. Moreover, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, just in the past 24 hours alone, the occupiers' losses in Pokrovsk as a result of stabilization measures carried out by special units of the Special Operations Forces of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense amounted to about 100 personnel. These include both irrecoverable and accordingly sanitary losses. And over the entire period of the assault on Pokrovsk, which was loudly announced by the military command of the Russian occupation forces, specifically the period of intensified hostilities from roughly September to November, the total losses of the occupiers amounted to about 15,000 personnel. These are catastrophic losses even for the Russian occupation army. And most importantly, let's refute those reports that appeared, for example, in the Moscow Times. The point is that Using this particular example of a media outlet considered to be opposition, we should, let's say, understand the information campaign of Russian media and, so to speak, those interested in the Russian political leadership and propagandists. It is reported that, and I quote verbatim, Pokrovsk had a population of almost 400,000 people before the war. And now, attention, dear viewers, I am addressing first and foremost, including Russian viewers. According to the 2001 census, Pokrovsk had a population of 81,538 people. Accordingly, according to the next census, and as of 2022, or rather 2020, I apologize, Pokrovsk had 61,700 residents. So, what is this publication talking about when it mentions 400,000? Moreover, let's move on. It is reported that in recent weeks we have been witnessing a steady deterioration of the situation around Pokrovsk. Here they are already quoting the military expert Mark, and then they provide his direct quote. In October, the Russian armed forces managed to enter one of the last major cities in Donbass that was under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. Well, for military experts and accordingly for Russian media, let me clarify. About 33% of the territory in Donetsk region remains under the control of Ukraine's defense forces. This is exactly what constitutes a failure. A failure of the plans of the Russian military political leadership. After 4 years of active combat operations, they are still unable to accomplish even an intermediate objective, namely establishing full control over the territory of Donetsk region. And specifically for the German military expert, let me clarify. The largest industrial cities in Donetsk region remain under the control of Ukraine's defense forces. Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkovka, plus respectively Seversk, Liman, and the Pokrovskaya agglomeration. This is not Pokrovsk itself. This is besides Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Dobropol. These are similarly the largest settlements in the controlled territory of Donetsk Oblast. We are talking about Ukraine controlled by the armed forces. Therefore, when information of this kind is reported, especially with reference to a German military source, it is necessary once again to emphasize, let's say, the lack of objectivity in the information itself and the complete inaccuracy of the assessments of the situation, both on the front line and accordingly in the evaluation of the socioeconomic situation in Donetsk Oblast.
Regarding the losses and resource base of the Russian Federation, considering the intensity of the autumn attacks, what does this mean? They will simply, so to speak, move into the winter phase. And just how critical are all these losses? How replaceable are they? And will heads roll? I recall how there was a replacement. Shoigu was replaced by Belousov because things at the front were not going according to plan or deadlines. I also recall how Surovikin was removed from his position as commander of the Russian aerospace forces. Besides the mutiny, there were other reasons as well. The same story. Resources were spent, there were local assaults and all that. We remember both Avdiivka and Bakhmut, but nevertheless, the results the Kremlin expected were not achieved. How do you assess the resources, and will heads roll?
Heads have already started to roll. It should be noted that a meeting was held by the head of the general staff of the occupying country's army. As a result of the meeting, it was acknowledged that the plans had not been fulfilled. At the time of the capture of Pokrovsk and the second Kupiansk, the losses of the Russian occupation forces were written off. At this point, personnel decisions have already been made, specifically the removal of Lieutenant General Melchakov from his position as commander of the 51st Army, I should note. And this is a very serious indicator that all the statements made by Gerasimov himself, and accordingly the Russian dictator about significant tactical successes on the line of contact are absolutely not true. Personnel decisions are the clearest indicator and evidence that the summer-autumn campaign of the Russian occupation forces has essentially stalled. Regarding losses, let me emphasize once again, the losses are colossal. Moreover, it should be noted that according to the Ministry of Defense of the occupying country, as of now, accordingly, the Russian army has signed contracts with about 330,000 so-called volunteers, meaning those who voluntarily signed the contract. And now pay attention. According to estimates from both Ukrainian intelligence and accordingly Western intelligence agencies, the losses of the occupation army for the period from January to accordingly November amount to about 350,000. In other words, the level of losses in the Russian army exceeds its ability to replenish its personnel. And I should note, the year isn't even over yet, and the intensity of fighting near Pokrovsk is only increasing, and accordingly, so are the losses of the occupiers. Moreover, the intensity of the fighting is not only seen near Pokrovsk, but accordingly along the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian front. And let me remind you, the length of the front at the moment is about 1,000 to 1,150 kilometers. So as we can see, the losses are colossal. Moreover, the Russian Federation is now seriously talking about the possibility of conducting a second and third wave of so-called partial mobilizations. And this, in turn, leads to social tension directly within the territory of the occupying country.
Yes, and considering that they definitely won't be paying anymore. There's nothing to pay with. Yes, nothing to pay with. Thank you, Dmitry, for joining us. Dmitry Snegirev, military political analyst.